7 men lay dead against a freezing brick wall inside a Chicago garage, their bodies torn apart by an unprecedented volume of automatic gunfire. It was the morning of February 14, 1929, and the St. Valentine's Day massacre had just become the most notorious unsolved crime in American history. The killers had vanished into the winter snow, leaving behind a chaotic slaughterhouse and a city paralyzed by fear and suspicion. The most chilling detail emerged from the few terrified witnesses who dared to speak. They reported seeing 2 men in pristine police uniforms exiting the garage immediately after the gunfire ceased. This single observation threw the entire investigation into disarray. Were these rogue cops executing rival criminals, or were they mobsters exploiting the ultimate disguise? The public demanded justice, but the authorities were chasing shadows in a city controlled by organized crime. At that time, criminal investigations relied almost entirely on a detective's intuition, informant whispers, and notoriously unreliable eyewitness testimony. The concept of physical evidence was in its infancy, often limited to obvious clues like a dropped hat or a muddy footprint. When suspects were hauled in, they quickly invoked habeas corpus, demanding to be charged with hard proof or released. Without a confession or cooperative witness, the police were completely powerless. Yet the killers had left behind a different kind of witness, one that could not be intimidated or bribed. Scattered across the cold concrete floor of the garage were 70 fired cartridge cases. Embedded in the brick wall and the wooden beams were dozens of deformed lead projectiles. To the untrained eye of a 1920s beat cop, this was simply debris. But to a new breed of investigator, it was a detailed map of the murder. The investigation quickly stalled. The surviving mobsters adhered to their code of silence, and the Chicago Police Department was paralyzed by allegations of internal corruption. The traditional methods of interrogation and deduction had failed completely. The city needed a breakthrough, a way to interrogate the physical remnants of the crime scene without relying on human memory. Explaining the mechanical reality of the massacre required a fundamental shift in how justice was pursued. The answer arrived in the form of Calvin Goddard, a physician, former Army officer, and meticulous firearms enthusiast. Goddard was a visionary who viewed crime scenes not as chaotic tragedies, but as puzzles governed by the rigid laws of physics. He believed that the era of gut-feeling detective work was obsolete. He knew that when science meets the chaotic aftermath of a shooting, objective truth replaces human error. Goddard understood a fundamental premise that most police officers did not. A gun barrel is not a perfectly smooth, uniform tube of metal. During the manufacturing process, a tool called a broach is pulled through the steel barrel to carve spiral grooves, known as rifling. This process imparts a spin to the bullet for accuracy, but it also leaves behind microscopic scrapes, gouges, and imperfections on the interior surface of the weapon. Because the broach wears down slightly with every microscopic cut, no 2 gun barrels are ever exactly alike, even if they are manufactured sequentially on the same assembly line. The interior of every firearm is a unique microscopic landscape of steel. Goddard realized that this manufacturing reality held the key to criminal identification. The weapon itself carried a hidden signature, waiting to be read by anyone equipped with the right tools. When a weapon is fired, the explosive pressure forces the relatively soft metal of the bullet through the harder steel barrel. As the bullet travels, the unique imperfections of the barrel score its surface, engraving a permanent, 3-dimensional mechanical fingerprint into the lead and copper. Simultaneously, the violent rearward action of the firing mechanism stamps unique microscopic signatures onto the base of the brass cartridge case. The challenge before Goddard was how to observe and prove these microscopic signatures in a way that a jury could understand. Previously, investigators tried looking at 2 bullets side by side with a standard magnifying glass. This method was deeply flawed, highly subjective, and easily dismantled by defense attorneys in court. Staring at 2 separate objects and trying to remember the scratch patterns was not science. It was merely an educated guess. To eliminate this subjectivity, Goddard championed the use of a revolutionary piece of equipment, the comparison microscope. This device consisted of 2 separate compound microscopes connected by a specialized optical bridge. It allowed an examiner to view 2 separate objects simultaneously in a single split field of view. By placing a crime scene bullet under one lens and a test bullet under the other, the 2 could be visually fused together. Under the comparison microscope, the examiner could rotate the bullets independently until the microscopic striations aligned across the dividing line of the lenses. If the bullets were fired from the same weapon, the scratches and gouges would flow continuously from one bullet to the other, creating a perfect, unbroken landscape of lines. It was an elegant, undeniable visual proof that eliminated the guesswork from firearms identification. Desperate for objective truth, a coroner's jury in Chicago invited Goddard to examine the overwhelming pile of evidence from the St. Valentine's Day massacre. The city needed to know, definitively, if their own police officers had committed the murders. Goddard arrived in Chicago and immediately established a strict chain of custody, ensuring that every piece of evidence was meticulously cataloged, secured, and shielded from tampering before his analysis began. Goddard set up his equipment and began sorting the 70 shell casings and recovered bullets. Through painstaking microscopic analysis, he quickly determined the exact types of weapons used in the garage. The killers had not used standard police-issue shotguns or revolvers. Instead, the ballistics profile pointed directly to two specific Thompson submachine guns, a weapon heavily favored by organized crime syndicates, firing .45 caliber ammunition. This initial finding was crucial, but Goddard needed the actual weapons to make a definitive match. Months later, a routine police raid on a home in Michigan turned up a massive hidden arsenal. The weapons belonged to Fred Burke, a known associate of Al Capone's criminal enterprise. Among the seized firearms were two Thompson submachine guns. The authorities immediately shipped the weapons to Chicago for Goddard to examine. To test the weapons, Goddard fired pristine rounds from Burke's machine guns into a specialized recovery box filled with cotton. This process allowed him to capture intact bullets and shell casings that bore the unquestionable mechanical signature of those specific firearms. He then took these test-fired specimens and placed them under the lenses of his comparison microscope, side by side with the mangled evidence recovered from the bloody garage floor. The tension in the laboratory was palpable as Goddard peered through the eyepieces. He slowly rotated the test bullet, watching the microscopic landscape shift against the crime scene bullet. Suddenly, the chaotic scratches aligned. The heavy extractor marks on the shell casings matched perfectly. The firing pin impressions were identical. The grooves carved by the rifling flowed seamlessly across the optical bridge. It was a flawless, undeniable mechanical match. Goddard had done the impossible. He had scientifically linked the weapons found in Fred Burke's closet directly to the St. More importantly, he attached a camera to the microscope, capturing the aligned striations on photographic film. It was no longer a matter of a detective relying on a personal hunch to identify a murder weapon. It was a reproducible photographic fact that anyone, including a judge and jury, could see with their own eyes. This breakthrough instantly cleared the Chicago Police Department of direct involvement in the shooting. The science proved that the killers were indeed mobsters who had donned police uniforms as a tactical disguise. The revelation fundamentally altered the trajectory of the investigation, shifting the focus entirely onto Al Capone's network. But the impact of Goddard's work extended far beyond the resolution of a single gangland execution in Chicago. The legal system was forced to adapt to a new standard of evidence. Courtrooms that once relied on the shaky memories of terrified witnesses were now confronted with the immutable laws of physics. Defense attorneys could no longer easily dismiss physical evidence as circumstantial. Forensic ballistics had arrived, transforming the microscopic scratches on a piece of lead into undeniable testimony that could withstand the most aggressive cross-examination. The success of the investigation sparked a realization among the civic leaders of Chicago. They recognized that science could solve complex mysteries that traditional detective work could not. The era of the brilliant, intuitive lone investigator was giving way to the era of the laboratory technician. To institutionalize this new approach, local business leaders pooled their resources to fund a permanent facility dedicated entirely to scientific criminal investigation. This initiative led directly to the creation of the Scientific Crime Detection Laboratory at Northwestern University. Opening its doors in the wake of the massacre, it was the very first independent forensic laboratory in the United States. Calvin Goddard was appointed as its first director, tasked with expanding the boundaries of forensic science. The laboratory became the epicenter for a revolution in how law enforcement processed crime scenes. At Northwestern University, Goddard and his team did not just focus on firearms. They pioneered techniques in blood analysis, fingerprinting, and trace evidence collection. They established rigorous protocols for maintaining the chain of custody, ensuring that evidence collected in the field remained legally pristine by the time it reached the courtroom. They were writing the foundational rulebook for modern forensic methodology, replacing guesswork with empirical data. Law enforcement agencies across the country took notice. The FBI, observing the success of the Northwestern Laboratory, soon established its own National Crime Lab, heavily modeled on Goddard's blueprint. The standard for criminal investigations was permanently elevated. Police departments began training specialized evidence technicians, recognizing that the first step in solving a crime was no longer interrogating suspects, but carefully preserving the physical environment of the crime scene itself. The legacy of this shift is still felt in every modern investigation. Today, generating a ballistics profile is a standard, heavily computerized process. but the foundational logic remains exactly as Goddard defined it. The comparison microscope is still a vital tool in crime labs around the world. The rigorous logic of detection, born from the necessity to solve a brutal gangland murder, has become the bedrock of criminal justice. Valentine's Day massacre was intended to be the perfect, unsolvable crime, executed by phantoms in a lawless city. Instead, it became the catalyst for a scientific revolution. By forcing investigators to look closer, past the blood and the brick, to the microscopic scars on a piece of metal, the tragedy created modern forensic ballistics. It proved that while criminals might silence witnesses, they can never silence the evidence.